Welcome to How Do We Confront Trumpism Now and Going Forward, Marxist-Humanist Perspectives. Our four speakers will be myself, Brendan Cooney, Jaclard, Andrew Kliman, and Adam Plante. I'll introduce each of them with a brief bio before they speak. I just say a couple of things. We have a mailing list going around here in this white legal pad. If you'd like to know more about future events and writings by Marxist-Humanist initiative, if you sign up for the mailing list, there are very infrequent emails sent out through MailChimp with links to recent videos, talks, articles that have been published by the organization, etc. I'll say a couple things about what Marxist-Humanist initiative is and does briefly. A great introduction to the group's work might be to check out our perspectives from 2018 called Resisting Trumpist Reaction and Left Accommodation. One of the things I like about the pamphlet is that it's a collectively written pamphlet. You'll see no author's names on the work. It took many months of work to, as an organization, to put together a coherent document that spans a lot of topics, from Trumpism to white nationalism to Marxist writings on Irish independence to the resurgence of left economic populism and post-truth. And we have a coherent narrative that speaks to these contemporary issues, but is firmly rooted in Marxist theory of liberation. And that's a lot of what this group seeks to do, is to be firmly rooted in the Marxist-Humanist tradition and understanding Marx's work as a theory of freedom and liberation, and to have relevance to contemporary times, not to treat it as a stagnant body of work, but something that's alive and breathing and continuing to grow in response to real objective conditions and subjective struggles against those conditions. Some of the papers of this video will be on our website, Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org, eventually, probably in a week or two. And a lot of the essays will be in some written format there too as well. So you can look there for more follow-up. Am I forgetting any important details? Okay. Our first speaker will be myself, Brendan Cooney. I'm from Philadelphia. I write on a website called capitalism101.wordpress.com. That's capitalism with a K. I'm not quite as active as I used to be, but that's because I got a little old and life caught up with me, but I'm still active. I'm going to start my timer. We're going to have four people speak, and then we'll have time for questions and comments and fisticuffs and everything. So, I suspect I'm not alone. The title of my talk is Less New Deal, More Green. And we have a very short flyer over there which summarizes some of my arguments if you want to read it. Also, this is sort of a follow-up on a talk I did a few months ago at the Historical Materialism Conference here in New York, and that's up on our website, and you can see more of my thinking about the Green New Deal there. I suspect I'm not alone in the suspicion that current calls for a Green New Deal are tragically flawed. Flawed because the so-called Green New Deal contains promises and aspirations that are not likely attainable within a capitalist society. And tragic because at a time when urgent global action is necessary to avert climate catastrophe, the monumental task of putting climate action at the forefront of the political agenda has been made many times more difficult by left populists who have confused the issue by using the fight against climate change as a slate upon which to attach all of their social democratic fantasies. One might think, if one was thinking logically, that given all of the political obstacles to addressing climate change within the short time frame we now have left, and given the monumental practical task of moving society off its fossil fuel dependence, one might think would not be wise to make this task even more monumental by also turning the fight against climate change into a reboot of the New Deal, in which we are supposedly going to also have a job guarantee program at a living wage without destabilizing labor markets, free college education and free health care for all without creating runaway inflation, Given the existential threat of climate change, one might think that society should judge the success of proposed green policies on their ability to ward off climate change. But instead, the zealots of the Green New Deal want us to measure the success of green policies by their ability to achieve populist economic outcomes. This seems like a dangerous and illogical calculation. It is highly likely that the rosy, egalitarian promises being made by the AOCs of the populist left will not be possible. I'm skipping ahead here for time. Because these populists are promising everything and claiming that there will be no cost to the 99%, their constituency will be in for a rude awakening, either when they see their tax bill or when their promised economic miracle fails to materialize. When this rude awakening happens, where will that leave the fight against climate change? One might think that, logically, the success of a job guarantee program is measured by its economic outcome. Actually, this is a little bit redundant. Let me skip ahead here. But this conflation of climate activism and left populism, though on its face illogical and reckless, makes total sense to a lot of people on the left. I think this is because of certain assumptions that many leftists have about economics and politics. This paper tries to explore some of these assumptions and to suggest that they are not the best ways of approaching politics from the left. Of course, this is a panel about fighting Trumpism. The Trump issue is inherently bound up in the fight against climate change because unless we defeat Trump and Trumpism, there can be no forward movement on the climate issue. Also, the bad assumptions that underlie much of the left environmentalism are also equally present in left narratives about Trump. I draw some of those out explicitly, and maybe if you look like intelligent people, you'll make some of those inferences if I don't draw them out all that explicitly. Also want to say that this sort of trying to look at the underlying assumptions behind some of this left populism is a continuing project. There's a whole section in our pamphlet that addresses the rise of economic populism amongst the left, and this is sort of in that vein. First assumption is that left politics is social democratic economic reform. It has become commonplace for political commentators to refer to the rising popularity of left economic populist ideas as a matter of people, quote, moving farther to the left. The reigning assumption seems to be that left politics is social democratic politics. That is, the politics of pursuing equality and justice through income redistribution and state economic investment and regulation. We have come quite a long way from the 1930s, when the New Deal was seen as an alternative to the radical leftists who wanted to overthrow capitalism and replace it with a more humane system. But now, in the age of there is no alternative, what was once the centrist compromise is now painted as the radical left. Many on the left, swept up by the excitement of this new reality, where people are no longer afraid to call themselves, quote, socialists, have not been interested in whether or not this turn to socialism represents any threat or alternative to capitalism. AOC herself has said that socialism and capitalism are compatible, implying that these two terms do not refer to her to modes of production. Indeed, the whole linguistic landscape is full of a muddled and irresponsible use of words, mirroring an underlying theoretical quagmire of messy thinking. On the one hand, the appearance of social democratic reformism as the inheritor of the leftist mantle may be the result of the failure of the left to theorize an alternative to capitalism in the wake of the disasters of those societies which called themselves communist in the 20th century. But there's likely more to it than that. Many on the left have failed to break theoretically with 20th century communism. They share the view that state-controlled production is the hallmark of leftist politics. Thus, social democratic redistributionism, while perhaps inadequate to fix all of the problems of capitalism, is to them a stepping stone towards state ownership of production. Such a state of affairs is a tragedy for those interested in not following Marx's vision of how we go about theorizing an alternative to capital. Not only would Marx scoff at the reformist fantasies of social democrats, but he would likely recoil in horror at the so-called Marxists who fetishize state property and planning, substituting them for human liberation. But despite the failures of both Keynesianism and state capitalism in the 20th century, many on the left instinctively are committed to the notion that this is what we do as leftists. We come up with social democratic spending plans, tax the rich, and hope society will move in the general direction of state ownership and planning. And these instincts, I believe, pervade the Green New Deal. A second assumption is reduction to the economic. The left also suffers from an instinct to reduce everything to the economic, and to assume that the left must provide an economic program to remedy all social ills. Thus, the climate issue must be transformed into a Green New Deal. Trump voters must be won over with job guarantees and universal health care, etc. It may seem strange to question this economic perspective. After all, Marxists are always trying to illuminate the contradictions of capital that lie behind the social ills of our society. And we, of course, fought a decades-long battles to defend the primacy of class and mode of production against the postmodernists. But is it really true that every oppression and injustice reduces solely to an economic injustice? And isn't it possible that the struggles against sexism, racism, police brutality, anti-immigrant sentiment, etc., can and should articulate their visions of a new society that are entirely reducible to overthrowing capital or to economic projects? The issues of immigration and racism are directly related to climate change. The struggle to protect the rights and lives of immigrants and the struggles against nativism and racism, which we fight today in the era of Trumpism, are a dress rehearsal for the sort of struggles we will face in the near future as climate chaos wrecks the planet. Climate politics does not necessarily need to be all about rosy economic proposals for a social democratic fantasy land. Why not put the rights of refugees at the center of our climate movement? Why is this left out of much of the discussion? Why is single-payer health care or free college education more relevant than the rights of refugees to a climate agenda? The Green New Deal's priorities only make sense if one realizes this uncritical economism that underlies so much of left thought. A third assumption is voluntarism. At the heart of economic populism is a voluntarist conception of capitalism. By voluntarism, I mean a conception in which the social antagonisms, inequality, and violence of capitalist society are the results of bad actors or bad ideas, rather than the inevitable product of a mode of production founded upon exploitation. Voluntarist thinking suggests that the answer to capitalism's contradictions is just to replace these bad actors with good actors, to replace bad ideas with good ideas. Economic populists, even when they call themselves democratic socialists, argue that they can run capitalism better than the capitalists. Voluntarist thinking blames neoliberals and neoliberal thinking for all the social ills of our generation, and suggests that a return to a more benevolent state capitalism can reproduce the now mythical economic boom of the 50s. But if we see the cycles of boom and bust that have plagued capitalism since its beginnings as a result of inevitable and irreconcilable internal contradictions, then it seems unlikely that any state power, even if in the control of the most enlightened social democrats, can bend those inevitable laws of capital to their own will. It may even be the case that the remarkable boom of the 1950s was a unique event in the long arc of capital's history, a period of growth brought on by the high profitability made possible by the massive destruction of World War II. Marx's theory of crisis suggests that it is the massive destruction of capital in a crisis that sets the stage for the corresponding boom phase.
5 minutes.
The more massive, global, and complex capital becomes, the more destruction required to overcome a crisis. The counter-cyclical measures now taken by governments to ameliorate recessions are somewhat successful in dampening the blow of recessions, but this comes at a price. By not allowing enough destruction of capital, the economy may never bounce back like it did in the 1950s. Promises of win-win situations, though, are at the heart of economic populism. While populist rhetoric is drenched in anti-elitism of biting critiques of the rich and powerful, the promise of populism is always a win-win situation for labor and capital, in which workers have high wages, free health care, and college tuition, great infrastructure, without paying any economic price. This sort of rhetoric may help sell tickets to Bernie Sanders rallies, but it does nothing to aid in the development of anti-capitalist thought and movements. It is also a far cry from the harsh realism and commitment to truth that is required to address the climate issue. Okay. 4, winning constituencies with promises. Left populists also believe that politics is 1, a process of winning constituents, and 2, that this is done by bribing potential constituents with economic promises. To take the first half of this, left populists assume that it is their destiny to lead and the role of the masses to follow them. It's a replication of the same separation of mental and manual labor which Marx identifies as the central contradiction within capitalist society. Marxist-Humanism, by contrast, holds that the self-developing subject, the revolutionary development of the masses as their own force of reason is the hallmark of anti-capitalist politics. And so Marxist-Humanism does not seek to lead or appropriate struggles or win constituents to a platform. Because left populists believe that they have all the answers already worked out, and that the masses merely must buy into their pre-existing platform, they assume people are simple-minded and selfish enough that they must be bribed with promises. Thus, social democrats are reduced to promises of free stuff with no consequences. But it is dangerous to assume that people will always fall for the candidates and platforms of these snake oil salesmen. I know plenty of people, for instance, that supported Clinton over Sanders in 2016, not because they were more moderate politically, not because they were scared of his, quote, socialism, but because they were intelligent people that thought Sanders was full of shit. Besides, right populism, Trumpists, neo-fascists, can do just as much promising and project hatching as the left. Furthermore, it is dangerous to assume that people can only be motivated by narrow economic self-interest. A true anti-capitalist left requires solidarity, the notion that none are free until all are free. And a real green politics requires an honest assessment of the sacrifices required to avert climate catastrophe.
2 minutes.
Fighting for Trump's base is the last assumption. I'll skip to a quote from the Data for Progress in their outline of pitch for the Green New Deal. They write, 35% of people, percent of Trump voters supported the green job guarantee, and 36% opposed, while 30% supported the community job guarantee, compared with 45% opposed. This indicates a green job guarantee can help progressives draw support from typically unsupported voters. In other words, the Green New Deal is going to help us siphon away Trump voters and win the next election. This is naive fantasy. One can only believe such a thing if one has been living in a cave for the past 3 years, completely oblivious to the political polarization in this country. Donald Trump has delivered on none of his populist economic proposals, yet his base has remained just as devoted to Trumpism as they were when he was promising infrastructure projects and the return of American manufacturing jobs. Even in industries which are suffering from his trade war with China and Canada, Trump voters remain loyal to Trump. He can lock children in cages, but the mothers who voted for Trump still support him. He can collude with Putin, but the flag-waving patriotic Americans still support him. He can cheat on his wife with porn stars and Russian hookers, but evangelical Christians still support him. To think that Trump voters will vote for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren because they support a green job guarantee is the most dangerous naivete. Rather, the 2020 election will hinge on one question. If the election is seen as a referendum on Trump, Trump will likely lose. But if the election is seen as a referendum on a controversial left candidate, Trump will likely win. Furthermore, the fight against climate change hinges on whether or not Trump is defeated. If he stays in office, we are truly screwed. Our next speaker is Jaclard, and her bio is here. Jaclard has been an activist in U.S. social movements and a writer on the movements and on Marxist-Humanist theory for decades. She currently serves as organizational secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. And I'll keep time for you, Ann.
Okay. How can we confront Trumpism now and going forward is our title. And my paper is called Trumpism's Active and Passive Support by the So-Called Left. It's a combination of the left that we believe is helping Trump. MHI has spent the past 3 years denouncing the dangers of Trumpism. And since he got into office, supporting the grassroots resistance and fighting the soft on Trump so-called left over ideas that we consider vital, literally vital for the future of humans, of the earth, and liberal democracy. The U.S. is on the brink of authoritarianism, threatening to obliterate the rule of law and our civil liberties, threatening wars started on Trump's whim or his waiting for an excuse to suspend the rule of law, and meanwhile increasing people's misery at home and abroad, failing to hold and adding to irreversible climate disaster, eliminating minorities and women's rights, and much more evil than we ever imagined. As if snatching children from their parents were not bad enough, the government is now housing the children in conditions rightly termed concentration camps. Yet a whole segment of the so-called left remains mostly silent about Trump, Some of the same people who actively helped to elect Trump by refusing to vote for Clinton when it could have made a difference to the outcome. Then thousands of Bernie supporters and Greens and tiny left parties running candidates preferred to keep themselves pure than to do a simple little thing like vote when it was necessary to defeat Trumpism, as if voting had to define their entire political selves. MHI considers the real left to be the resistance, the approximately 30 million ordinary people and grassroots organizations that have flooded the streets, the halls of Congress to save health care and denounce Kavanaugh, flooded constituent meetings to confront their Congresspeople, protested at airports and at the southern border. They have been everywhere with the united cry of no to Trump and Trumpism. Yet the organized, self-defined left has been suspicious of and unsupportive of this real left from the start. And now little of that self-defined left seems to turn out to resistance events. I attended move-on impeach rallies in New York City in April and in June. Each had only a few hundred people. Very few identified left parties or groups. It was pitiful. In spite of Trump's record, segments of the so-called left continue to treat him less as a danger to be fought tooth and nail than as an opportunity for their own organization or political party to gain influence, perhaps even control, when the establishment parties self-destruct. This left's aim is to build their own parties into a position of power and to take power for themselves, take over the Democratic Party or eventually whatever, be voted into power. Whereas MHI seeks to empower people to run their own lives, that left only wants to succeed in being the leaders and governors. And we call these people left-firsters because their goal is only to benefit the left, not to destroy Trump, nor to help people to build a better world themselves, one without Trumpism and one without rulers. Today, I'm seeing and criticizing two kinds of left behavior that accommodates or even bolsters Trumpism. One is active support, like in 2016, when some deemed him a lesser evil than neoliberalism, or at least equal, and so they encouraged people not to vote for Clinton. And two, what I'm calling benign neglect. Some of the left just doesn't talk about Trump, as if whatever their issue is, they do not need to overcome Trumpism before they can make advances on their issue, which of course they do, so they just ignore him. Both of these tendencies tend to practice whataboutism. When a Trump horror is mentioned, they say, what about this other thing or the same thing that Obama did? That is, they find Trump no more offensive than other forms of capitalism. They fail to distinguish the benefits of liberal democracy from Putinism and dictatorship. This is crucial, absolutely crucial. I want to discuss these two tendencies further. First, the active support by people who think the Trump presidency will give their party the edge to follow Trump after him, us. These active left Trump supporters from 2016 are looking to promote their parties, even if it means screwing everyone and everything else by perpetuating Trumpism. These are the left-firsters, and we saw it in people such as Jill Stein, candidate of the Green Party, whose tepid condemnations of Trump combined with vociferous condemnations of Clinton may well have swayed enough voters to stay home or vote for third parties to enable Trump to win. We see it in people like Chris Cutrone of Platypus and others who act as if their mission is too important to waste their time fighting Trump. I'm not even talking about the people who foolishly say that the neoliberals would be just as bad as Trump, the burn it all down types who want to see the whole system destroyed by any means possible. Rather, I'm talking about those Bernie bros and third-party backers who saw an opportunity to win over the votes of cynical people for the purpose of building up their own parties without regard to what cause they were ushering in. Now millions of people are paying the price for this presidency. Poor, immigrants, people of color, women, and people of non-binary genders, and more millions of people around the world are suffering from Trump's policies. That he hasn't yet put you in jail does not mean he's, quote, so bad, as some of these people say. You would think after seeing what is going on with Trump wielding power, gathering more control over our lives daily, and threatening the existence of life on Earth, you would think that these soft on Trump folks would have rethought the issues, apologized for their very likely having enabled the election to go to him, and would have changed their mind, but we find them alive and well, if not advocating for their party's candidate, then just remaining silent about working to defeat Trump. MHI has continuously called on the left, and will continue to take stock, rethink, refocus, support the opposition to Trump, especially the resistance. We don't see that left, though, being interested in this work. I'm no longer trying to reason with that so-called left. I think they need to be smashed just as much as Trump and his support needs to be smashed. That is, stripped of all power and influence, thoroughly defeated, so they won't come back. Now, the segment of the left that I'm referring to as benign neglect, it's not benign. It's not actively supporting Trump as a lesser evil than Clinton, which sounds even more absurd 3 years later than it did before the election. But it's tacitly supporting him by remaining passive in the face of his actions. For example, it has been largely the liberals and religious groups who've been left to expose and protest his attacks on immigrants and refugees, most lately on the border. Another example, I was shocked back in April. I was at the Historical Materialism / Jacobin conference, and I attended a panel on abortion rights, and not one speaker even mentioned Trump. Okay, he's the biggest one threatening our right to reproductive health. At least one of the speakers was identified with Jacobin. I don't know if the others' politics were influenced by them or her. But when I mentioned the resistance from the floor, a speaker jumped down my throat, made derogatory remarks, and misrepresented, you know, I won't go into it unless you ask me in discussion. But they immediately changed the subject. Even more shocking was the student SDS conference at George Mason University in April. The video of that is on our website. I spoke about it in the last panel. The speakers and some of the audience there included full-blown Stalinistas, I call them, new youth Stalins. Praised the Soviet Union and called its history of murder and oppression a lie, and insisted that it was, in fact, actually socialism, and that's what we need again.
10 minutes.
One would think that recent events would have highlighted this less dangers to liberatory movements and caused increased resistance to Trump. We'll have to see. One event is the Mueller report. Its immediate suppression by Trump via his Attorney General should have caused all the left to support the demand for the release of the whole report at once, with massive protests in the street. There were some protests, but the left was noticeably absent from them and from two move-on impeachment rallies I attended recently. When the Mueller report came out, some of the left immediately began to repeat Trump's and Barr's lying insistence that Mueller found Trump did not collude with Russia. For this left, Barr's summary of the report was, at most, proof that nothing can be changed within the system. All right, you know, they always lie. All the decisive element of the states are in cahoots with Trump. And now Mueller found plenty of wrongdoing, even if he couldn't prove Trump's criminality. We've all seen Trump's collusion with Putin and his attempts to obstruct justice right out in plain sight. So why did some leftists and left liberals immediately make fun of Rachel Maddow and others for doubting that Barr's summary was accurate, which of course we soon found out it was completely inaccurate? Why would anyone countenance that and make that assumption unless they didn't care about getting rid of Trump or about the lives and well-beings of his victims? So I'm afraid this tendency still exists in the left. What scares me now is the run-up to the 2020 presidential election. We have so many Democratic nominees. It'll be unwieldy, and who knows what alliances will emerge. But if the Bernie Bros and Green Party back candidates with limited chances of defeating Trump and direct all their resources to promoting their candidate, and if they then refuse to vote for a Democratic candidate at a peak at not getting their person, where will we be? We could actually end up with another 4 years of Trump, in spite of the massive opposition to him, especially because, remember, the Electoral College, it could cause Trump to win even if he has as many as 6 million fewer votes than his competitor. He could still win again in the Electoral College. Last time he had 3 million less, he could have 6. Right. Not only do left-firsters attempt to... Oh, no problem. Not only do left-firsters attempt to divert and mislead the real left, they also cloud the idea of what change is possible and what the purpose of change is, what freedom is. For us, the goal is the self-development of the masses so they can run a different society in which they will control their own lives. For left-firsters, the only goal is empowering, quote, the left. Contrast Marx's vision of a new society in which human power is, he says, its own end. That is, human power is both the object and the subject of revolution. People will remake society themselves, or it will not be new, just be another class society of rulers and ruled. MHI advocates worldwide, thoroughgoing social and economic revolution in which the workers and grassroots movements self-develop into the people who can and will organize, win, and run a new society. We believe the left should help and support such a process, not only by encouraging the resistance to grow and develop its own organizations, which we certainly do. They must be independent of the left as well as the Democratic Party. But we also see a vital role for theory in revolution, theory based in Marx's philosophy of revolution, and those who purport to be left could contribute to that if they completely reorganize themselves and their views. So our perspective is nothing less than complete political and philosophic reorganization of the left so that it can help instead of hurt the mass movements to remove Trump, to stop fascism, and to get on the road to liberatory change. And if you buy our booklet of perspectives, you'll see more about that.
That was exactly 15 minutes, so I can tell you practiced that. I think that was very well done. Our next speaker is Adam Plante, and Adam Plante is a New York City area education activist. He works politically with Marxist-Humanist initiative.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm Adam, and I'm going to talk today about the rise of the far right and a disturbing attitude which can be found on the left, which Ann just spoke about in some detail. I'm going to try to paint the arc of what the real human consequences of that, of taking that stance, this soft on Trump or even supporting Trump, what the human consequences of that are, and why it's absolutely important to defend liberal democracy, even if you think that we need to do better than capitalism or the democratic form of organization. So what I'm going to talk about is the view that socialism has no use for democracy, and that therefore the rise of the global far right and the parallel decline of democracies on every inhabited continent in the world can be ignored or even worse, cheered on. Against this, I'm going to argue that the rights and protections offered by democratic republics must be defended by those working for a better society than capitalism, because these limited rights empower and protect, even though partially, empower and protect minorities and the working class. Not to mention, again, the human cost of authoritarianism, which by itself should be enough. To do this, I'm going to briefly present the position of a famous critic of liberal democracy, who, despite viciously critiquing its shortcomings, still argued that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Instead, I'm going to argue that liberal democracy must be defended, extended, and transcended as an integral part of the fight for socialism. So I was also at the Historical Material Conference in April, and since the last time I delivered this talk, Trump announced his complete split from democracy. Not 3 weeks ago, Trump once again boasted that he would break the law to win re-election by inviting any and all foreign interference in our next election. He said this during an interview in the Oval Office. And exactly 1 week later, at least when it aired, he threatened to imprison a journalist from Time magazine in an interview which also took place in the Oval Office. In March, Trump praised China's president for life after Xi Jinping abolished term limits, saying, maybe we'll give that a shot someday. On the very day of the Mueller report's release, Trump told the crowd that he might remain in office for at least 10 or 14 years. Yeah, no biggie. Last month, Trump retweeted Jerry Falwell Jr., who argued that Trump should have 2 years added to his first term as payback for time stolen by the Mueller investigation, which Mr. Moral Majority Jr. called a corrupt failed coup. Less than 2 weeks ago, Trump suggested in an unhinged series of tweets that the American people would demand that he stay in office for longer than 2 terms. And these are just recent incidents. Since I started rewriting this paper, it makes me sick every time I have to read the news and update it. The election of Donald Trump and other authoritarian strongmen around the world is a dire threat not just to democracy, but to any prospect of socialism as well. Frankly, just a freer society. The so-called left has not only failed to take this existential threat seriously, but at times even found common cause with right-wing, ultra-nationalist populism. This alone tells you what kind of state the left is in and what kind of left would compromise with white supremacy. In reality, the only thing being compromised in these exchanges is the left. Since announcing his campaign for the presidency on June 16, 2015, Donald Trump has threatened the foundations of our republic. From that day, and even before that with his nativist birtherism, Trump has posed a dire threat to the rule of law, freedom of the press, legitimacy of fair and free elections, checks and balances, an independent justice system and depoliticized judiciary, running out fingers here, minority rights and civil liberties, separation of powers, political pluralism, and in general the norms and principles of our admittedly flawed society. We need to defend these aspects of liberal democracy precisely because they are inadequate. Civil liberties, a free press, minority rights, equality before the law, fair justice system, protections from police and the state, these are all crucial protections for workers and minorities. And where they're not enough, where they exist in name only, instead jettisoning them for being bourgeois or idealistic, or just not enough. We as socialists, or as human beings, must fight to defend, extend, and transcend them as we face this authoritarian threat to human civilization. Because he's coming for us next. He said so. He said it in his February State of the Union address. He signaled that attacking socialism, whatever they want that to mean, is going to be a key component of his re-election campaign. Once again, Trump signaling his base to prepare for war, as he did when he declared the 2016 election to be a fraud before a single vote was even cast. But in the meantime, he's waged war on democracy. And it pains me greatly to say that the left has so far not taken this seriously enough, even when they have even taken it seriously at all. Trump has incited violence against the media and his political opponents, defended, even praised neo-Nazis, who march with torches in our street, who chant that Jews will not replace us, who murderously plow their vehicles into crowds of peaceful counter-protesters. Trump has directly fostered the rebirth of the far right with hate crimes and terrorism at astronomical levels, both in this country and abroad. In just the past few months, we've seen Jews and Muslims gunned down during prayer and their places of worship desecrated, arson attacks directed against black churches, an endless deluge of mass shootings inspired by far-right ideology and past mass murderers, hit lists assembled by terrorists in our own military, pipe bombs mailed to those who dare to speak up against these monstrosities, and journalists savagely murdered by authoritarian regimes who know that they can get away with it because this administration will do nothing to stop them, and instead will even partner with them in the largest arms deal in human history. Every time I deliver this talk, the list gets longer, and it needs to stop right now. We can't wait until the election. And nobody else is going to stop it for us. We're not going to have our elected officials come down from the sky and save us. We have to stop this. So these and a growing number of other atrocities are part of the global resurgence of the far right, unquestionably emboldened by the election of Donald Trump to the position of the quote-unquote leader of the free world. And now that the Republican Party has rapidly veered from a hawkish conservative party to a white nationalist one, they have no compunction about whatsoever explicitly defending terrorism, at least as long as it's white supremacists. Hell, just last week in Oregon, a state senator told the state troopers to, quote, send bachelors and come heavily armed. For a decade, the Republican Party has defended shamelessly far-right supremacist terrorism. They demanded that the Homeland Security, that the DHS repudiate a 2009 report about the rise of far-right extremism. A couple of weeks before I delivered this talk in April, actually pretty shortly before that, there was a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee on white nationalism, and they turned it into what Vanity Fair called a GOP pity party. They're identifying with white nationalism. What the hell are we waiting for? The GOP to take up arms themselves? These attacks are not unpredictable. The rhetoric chokes our air in this republic. The only thing that is not predictable is who it's going to be and when it's going to be, when the next one's going to be. Our air is choking in this republic on this evil aura. The fact that so much of the left has underestimated, defended, equivocated, and even egged Trump on is absolutely frightening, disgusting, and indefensible. It's suicidal. Leftists with two neurons to rub together to a single spark of brain activity do not support. This list is enormous. I don't know if I have time for it. Hate-mongering, nativism, xenophobia, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, scapegoatism, transphobia, authoritarianism, misogyny, corruption, homophobia, conspiracism, bigotry, discrimination, demagoguery, civil rights violations, downright sexual assault, babies being ripped from their mother's arms, locked in fucking cages, and stuffed into concentration camps in the middle of the desert. So, enough about that. My concern here is that people think that socialism has no need of democracy, so that people who want to do better than democracy are perfectly fine with signing on or just ignoring what I've just described. Some people think that the limited protections which liberal democracy provide the disadvantaged are expendable, or even that those people are expendable. I've already shown the disgusting consequences of this position and spoke in detail about those positions, so I'm going to skip ahead a bit. The protections of liberal democracy can empower working people even though they're far from perfect. And the contradiction between liberal democracy's half-freedoms and the inhumanity of a market economy which forces people to rent and alienate themselves on a daily basis just to survive, and barely at that in many cases, that can help create the conditions for a revolution. And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to suggest that socialism is democracy on steroids, or that we can just vote our way to a just and equitable society. Far from it. I think that Sanders' slogan of a political revolution is naive and dangerous. The revolution is not going to be conducted through bourgeois politics or voting or whatever alone. We have a bunch of writings on our website about this. A recent one, I believe from December, is called Not by Politics Alone. The rights and protections of liberal democracy, again, even though they're kneecapped by capitalism, are crucial to the socialist project, and leftists cannot sit by and condone this full-on assault on working people, what little protections they have. All right, so that famous critic of liberal democracy I mentioned earlier is Lenin. And don't get me wrong, I'm not signing off on even half of what he said. Marxist-Humanism has a very complicated relationship with Lenin's ideas. Very critical, but at the same time acknowledging that he's one of the least bad people before World War I, theoretically speaking, in Marxist circles. But what I want to really do is focus on one particular argument, which...
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Which he was remarkably consistent on in the periods between the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. There's a bit of a gap between 1905 and about 1915 when he's arguing this, but he picks it up again in 1915, and up until the October Revolution, he's remarkably consistent in holding this position. So, in State and Revolution, which is what really got me started on this argument, because it struck me that he spent 90 pages critiquing the Democratic Republic, and then he turned around and said that it was still crucial to socialism. He wrote that, quote, democracy is of enormous importance to the working class in struggle for emancipation. And again, he was rather consistent in holding this position in the years up to the October Revolution. In 1905, he wrote that the Democratic Republic was, quote, the only correct road. In 1916, he wrote that, quote, socialism is impossible without democracy. So he firmly held that, quote, Marxists know that democracy does not abolish class oppression. It only makes the class struggle more direct, wider, more open and pronounced, and this is what we need. The more democratic the system of government, the clearer will workers see that the root evil is capitalism and not lack of rights. In another work, he kind of expands on this a bit, and this is because, quote, capitalism engenders democratic aspirations of the masses, creates democratic institutions, aggravates the antagonism between capitalism and imperialism's denial of democracy and the mass striving for democracy. Capitalism and imperialism can be overthrown only by economic revolution. They cannot be overthrown by mere democratic transformations, even the most ideal. So what he's saying is that mere political democracy, which is mere formal recognition of the individual rights of citizens, a mouthful, is by itself inadequate. But the struggle for democracy, the struggle to defend these protections and extend them, that's crucial to the struggle for socialism. That is, to extend them is crucial to the struggle for socialism, and to transcend them is what we're ultimately looking for. And we won't be able to transcend them without people self-developing in trying to struggle for these limited rights. That if people aren't even willing to defend the right to have, terribly disenfranchised voting rights, how are they going to sign on to socialism? So there are two important things to keep in mind about this view of democracy. Number one, democracy is limited, but number two, the struggle to implement even these limited rights and to preserve them can serve to awaken the spirit of striving for real full liberation and not just stopping short at mere liberties. So given what Lenin admits about the faults of democracy, he reminds us that, quote, democracy is by no means a boundary not to be overstepped. He says that all democratic rights without exception are conditional, restricted, formal, narrow, and extremely difficult of realization. However, he does admit that it's essential to this transformation because it declares the principle of equality. Quote, as soon as equality is achieved for all members of society in relation to the ownership of the means of production, in other words, once become increasingly economically and politically democratized, humanity will inevitably be confronted with the question of advancing from formal equality to actual equality. Such a degree of democracy implies overstepping the boundaries of bourgeois society and beginning its socialist reorganization. So I just want to end by kind of summarizing this argument a bit. So yeah, democracy is limited, but actually I think precisely because of this, it's really important that we protect these limited rights. And first of all, even if you don't buy this argument, I have some problems with, especially where Lenin goes with this argument. But even if you don't buy this argument, god damn, look at the human cost of this. That's reason alone to defend what little protections people have. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Our final speaker, actually I should say after our final speaker, we will have time for questions. So I hope that people are, and comments, hope that people are making notes of things you want to say or ask afterwards. And this panel, So our final speaker is Andrew Kliman. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at Pace University. He is the author of Combating White Nationalism, Lessons from Marx. That essay you can find up on the Marxist-Humanist Initiative website. His many writings include two books, Reclaiming Marxist Capital, A Refutation of the Myth of Inconsistency, which I believe is up there, and The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession, which also coincidentally is up there. He works politically with Marxist-Humanist Initiative and writes frequently for With Sober Senses, which is the name of MHI's online publication. I didn't say that before.
Thank you. This essay was originally a standalone essay, Combating White Nationalism, Lessons from Marx, is what I'm going to be talking about. Part of it right now, they got revised by our MHI and approved by the organization. The actual essay begins with an argument: Trumpism is really an expression of an entrenched and long-standing white nationalist tendency in American politics. Trumpism is a pre-existing condition. Then I'm able to move on to lessons from Marx, what to do about it, and that's what I'm going to be presenting today. Okay, so I have trouble with the interface between my computer and the projection system. Right. Okay, so the first thing to understand the lessons that we can learn from Marx is to understand his political orientation, which is very hard for people to understand because it differs so much from the mainstream orientation of the mainstream left. So first of all, I want to explain their orientation, then contrast it with Marx's political orientation, and then we can talk about how Marx went about combating white nationalism. Jaclard was talking a bit about this left-first orientation. So I'll recap. The left-firsters, like Trump is America first, these are left-firsters, their goal is to build the left. They continually say that. They want to win victories for themselves. Okay? They regard, therefore, common people as a constituency that they should try to capture. It tries to win them over by meeting them where they're at. You hear that a lot. So it offers a populism, a form of populism that it hopes the authoritarian white nationalist Trumpite base will find appealing. And so, look at the consequences of this. It treats the Trumpite base, it treats Trumpism as a legitimate rival that it's competing with. It tries to outcompete it with a positive program of its own. This is normalization of Trumpism. It does not treat Trumpism as a threat and an abomination that must be eliminated. And it's just completely harmful. Okay, in absolute contrast to this was the practice of Karl Marx. Marx championed the independent movement of the workers. And when I got a little Marx symbol, it always means it's a direct quote. Okay? The words of the workers, really significant. Not their alleged representatives, our party, no, of the workers themselves. And Marx didn't just say the independent movement of the workers as an end in itself. It was a means, in his view, for their emancipation from class society and the emancipation of all humanity from class society and state domination. It certainly was not understood as a means to further the interests of the left. Okay? Okay, another point. Marx, as everybody knows, was an internationalist. He fought working people's identification with their nation's ruling classes. Famously, in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, he wrote, "The working man have no country." Okay? He viewed that kind of nationalist identification with one's ruling class as just completely antithetical to the independent, emancipatory self-activity of working people. Okay? Finally, he championed class solidarity. He opposed economic and social conditions that divide working people from one another and foster privileges and prejudices. Okay? And that, indeed, as we're going to see, is the main reason he supported victory for the North in the U.S. Civil War and victory for the Irish in their struggle for independence from England. Okay? And that has everything to do with white nationalism in both cases. Okay? He wrote more about the national emancipation of Ireland, so I want to focus on that. The main reason Marx supported Irish independence was not humanitarian. He took that for granted. But he sought to stimulate the independent emancipatory self-development of the working class, especially the English working class. He wanted English workers to fight for Irish independence, quote, not as a matter of sympathy with Ireland, but as a demand made in the interest of the English proletariat. And he wrote that the national emancipation of Ireland is the first condition of English workers' own social emancipation. And he had a cute little song to go with it.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Charlie, for the musical interlude. Okay, but this raises a really interesting question. National emancipation of Ireland? in the interest of the English workers? Just how the hell is Irish independence going to aid English working people? Answer, Marx's answer. It would strike a blow against English workers' anti-Irish, supremacist attitudes, and their nationalistic identification with the English ruling classes. Okay, here's the full story. Irish immigrants were there, in London, in Manchester, elsewhere, competing with native workers for jobs in England. Marx wrote that this forces down wages and lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. And as a result, quote, the ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers the standard of life. And it wasn't just hatred. This hatred took the form of supremacist attitudes and narrow nationalism. Marx said, in relation to the Irish worker, the ordinary English worker regards himself as a member of the ruling nation. And consequently, he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself.
Yes.
He cherishes religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him, and this is why it's white supremacy, his attitude towards him is much the same as that of the, quote, poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA. Okay? So Marx's goal was to free English workers from what he called the ruling class's leading strings. And there you see a little kid being led around by leading strings. Because Marx's goal was the emancipatory self-development of the working class, not winning over a constituency to the left, he focused on the working class's world historic interests. He didn't pander to the perceived interest or the interest within capitalism of those whose opinions impeded the struggle for the freedom of every individual. And he regarded the nationalism and anti-Irish sentiment of much of the English working class as crucial impediments to that struggle. So what to do? To overcome these impediments, Marx said English rule over Ireland had to end. As long as the United Kingdom exists under, English rule, the English people will remain tied to the leading strings of the ruling classes because it will have to join with them in a common front against Ireland. Every one of the working class movements in England is crippled by the strife with the Irish. Okay, so what to do? Marx did not call for English and Irish workers to unite and fight. He didn't call on English workers to overcome their antagonism to the Irish. Okay, this was all futile in his view. Why? Because, quote, the English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. Okay, so what did he say to do? He did call on his organization, the International Men's Association, to side openly with Ireland and to accelerate the catastrophe of official England. Okay? And so he wrote, the most important object of the International is to hasten the social revolution in England. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent. Hence it is the task of the International everywhere to side openly with Ireland. You must accelerate the catastrophe of official England. To do so, you must attack her in Ireland, which is her weakest point. Once Ireland is lost, the British Empire will be gone, and the class war in England will assume acute forms. Okay, more briefly on the US Civil War, Marx's line of reasoning was very similar, but since we've gone through most of it, I'll be brief. He supported the North because he was convinced that its victory would end slavery. He was damn right about that. Okay? And that the ending of slavery, which was in his view, was not only in the interest of the black slaves, but of the whole working class. He wrote, and this was, I think, to Abraham Lincoln, as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. And he regarded the white supremacism of many U.S. workers as a barrier to progress. He wrote, they allowed slavery to defile their own republic and boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of Civil War.
10 minutes.
Okay. And in his book, Capital, he famously wrote, labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin where in the black it is branded. Why not? He doesn't say there, but elsewhere he wrote, a people which subjugates another people forges its own chains. Okay, that's the reasoning there. Okay, so to sum up Marx's view, okay, abolition of slavery in the U.S. and abolition of English rule of Ireland were not only good for blacks and Irish people, they were good for white and English working people as well. By weakening their identification with their ruling classes and eliminating privileges that kept them from solidarizing with black and English workers, abolition of slavery, abolition of English rule would help put white and English working people on the path of independent self-activity, aiming at the overcoming of class society and class rule. Okay, what about today? I was asked to explain why I believe that we have an analogous case. Okay, I've done it point for point. England and the U.S. 1861-70 versus the U.S. right now. Serious racial and national divisions among working people. Check, applies today. Back then, many English and white workers had supremacist attitudes, sided with their ruling classes against the Irish and black workers. Okay, many white workers today have supremacist attitudes and side with Trumpist reaction against immigrants and black workers. Same old shit. Excuse me. Okay, this was a crucial impediment to the independent emancipatory activity and self-development of the working class. Still is. Okay, continuing. Marx didn't pander to these English and white workers' perceived interests or interests in capitalism. Okay, we shouldn't do so either. Check. Working people in these countries, quote, Marx wrote, will never accomplish anything until England has gotten rid of Ireland and U.S. slavery is ended. Okay, working people in the U.S. will never accomplish anything until the U.S. has gotten rid of Trump and Trumpism is ended. Okay, and Adam Plante was talking a lot about that. Okay, so the key immediate task, Marx said, is to defeat England and the Confederacy. So right now, the key immediate task is to defeat Trump and Trumpism.
Can I ask a question?
No. Let me finish. My time is limited. So, Marx said, side openly with Ireland and with the North to accelerate the catastrophe of official England and southern slavocracy. The contemporary parallel of that is side openly with the resistance and to accelerate the catastrophe of Trumpism. Okay, to summarize the whole thing, Marx said, solidarize with English and white workers by decisively defeating England and the Confederacy. Their defeat will help liberate these workers from the grip of reaction and spur their independent self-development in an emancipatory direction. Okay? Solidarize today with the, quote, white working class by decisively defeating Trump and Trumpism. Their defeat will help liberate these workers from the grip of reaction and spur their independent emancipatory self-development. And one final thing. First things first. Authoritarians, and Trump's base is really authoritarian.
Oh, yeah.
Authoritarians worship the strong and powerful. They recoil from weakness and defeat. Hitler and Mussolini enjoyed strong support as long as they held power. Afterward, not so much. So the idea of first winning over Trump's authoritarian base and then defeating Trumpism, I think it's just a complete pipe dream. Okay, we must first hand Trumpism and Trump a crushing, humiliating defeat. Then his base is going to abandon him. And there's a nice little photo of Mussolini hanging out in the piazza.
I don't understand the relationship of the picture. Sorry.
Okay, that's Mussolini, no longer holding power, hanging out in the piazza.
Hanging upside down.
Yeah. Okay, my time is up, and I'm done.
So we have an hour for questions and comments. This is the first time I've ever chaired a panel where I didn't have to cut people off because they were so precise in their talks, including myself, I might add.
Serious people.
So I hope that we can all be precise too in our questions and comments, so I don't have to cut people off too much. I'll take hopefully 3 questions or comments at a time, and then turn to our panelists. Is that a question or a point?
No, just a point of information.
Please, yeah.
I noticed a bunch of us taking photos of the slides, and that's great. But we can also email them to you, and or the papers when they're published. So Want to sign the mailing list, sign it. If not, be in touch with us. All right?
And
Anybody
I-
want to, I'll send it around again.
Why don't you send it around just in case, right? Okay, well, hopefully we can take 3 or so at a time. So, hands, and we'll get the people. Questions, comments? Yes. Please.
Basically, I think the idea that it is necessary to crush Trump first is extremely valid because most of the working people I try to reach with my own propaganda, they see Trump as a savior and as that he is giving them a special leg up in the hierarchy in the United States, and if he is crushed, it will then make them rethink that. And I just wanted to know what folks thought of that. I think the rethinking of him once he's crushed is a very important step.
Yes.
Just as a counter, the white working class, in the event that Trump is crushed, defeated, whatever, I believe they would simply shift their allegiance to someone more smarter than Trump, someone more disciplined than Trump, you know, someone who is definitely will be more dangerous than Trump. I don't think they want to. Yeah, it would be nice if they would all or most of them see the light at work, but I'm a bit skeptical.
All right. Okay.
Other comments before the panelists jump in? Yes, please.
I went to a discussion on the Green New Deal. Apparently, people in general needs the education for them to really, if you want to crush Trumpism, I think the best route for that is equal socialism, because for one, in our environment is pretty much it's in danger. Last Friday here in New York City, the ozone layer was burning, and the air is so bad. It really caused not only myself but everybody to gag. So being able to focus on the environment, be able to focus the direction of eco-socialism. To me, it's a good step, because at the same time, we also have to educate the masses to really pinpoint that not only Trump and his goons are dangerous, but our planet is in danger as well. And these goons will do their best to deny that our environment is okay the way it is, right? So that's my response. And what is your take on eco-socialism?
Can you define that term? Eco-socialism?
Well, so it's a socialistic position to not only to confront the disaster of our planet, but also to probably go deep into the question on infrastructure, and to also, I'm not a pure theoretical, I'm not pure in theory, but to recognize the shift from industrial invention, say, from that to the current situation with solar, replacement of meat, what else, et cetera, as far as the inventions that could replace gas and so forth, and our ability to shift from where we are now with fossil fuel to the
Solar or whatever.
yeah, exactly.
Renewable.
Yeah, sure. We can take one more point. Sure. Go ahead.
Do you agree that the most important issue at the next election in 2020 is to get rid of Trump, and therefore ignore ignore any other issue. I read a letter to the editor of the New York Times just yesterday, and this lady was saying that no matter what, she is a one-issue voter, and I would agree with her. Would anybody else agree here?
And Trump was her one issue?
Yeah, get rid of Trump.
Can we take, we have four questions or comments. Can we take responses from the panelists? And then we'll open the floor up for more. Can we go backwards order from how we spoke? So, Andrew, you go first.
Yeah. The gentleman who said that it's important that Trump be crushed and that'll cause his base to rethink, and that's very important. That is Jaclard sitting there, who is probably the foremost expert on the American far right. And so that carries a lot of weight when somebody says that. You know, his base might just support another authoritarian if we're talking about defeating him in an election. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about crushing Trumpism. I'm talking about a defeat for Trumpism, like the Confederacy was defeated, you know, in 1865. Okay? Then you had radical Reconstruction for a few years until, you know, those people came back. It's a lot harder today because they all were geographically confined in the South. Okay, and you could bring in troops and so forth. And now we got a whole different set of issues. But I'm talking about really crushing that whole movement so that there is no savior that's going to keep the privileged status and make them feel good about being white and all of that. And with respect to the whole issue of eco-socialism, I think it normalizes Trumpism, and not eco-socialism, but it's not the way to go to try to compete against Trumpism with a positive program, because that treats it as normal, and you know, we can capture the allegiance and they can capture the allegiance, and we're in normal political competition. No, this is a threat to our very existence. So it has to be crushed. As I was trying to indicate in the previous session, the Trumpite base is with him because they are white nationalists, they are authoritarian, racist, and anti-immigrant, and so forth. They got what they want. You're not going to pull them away with, you know, some social democratic stuff. It's just not going to happen.
Okay, we're working backwards. So, Ann?
I think what's really important to keep in mind about the strategy that Andrew's been going over in the last two presentations he's given is that this is a radically different kind of strategy. This is not this is not an attempt to out-politic Trump, to steal some of his base away. I mean, in the last one he talked about Obama Trump voters who were marginally more authoritarian, racist, etc. in many metrics. This is not a matter of trying to steal Trump voters or beat him with a positive program. So that one of the key things here is that this is a radically different approach, I suppose, to politics, but it's not a merely political approach. This is why it's so important. It's not just about defeat Trump, it's about defeat Trumpism. And the way you're not going to defeat Trumpism is left economic populism, fighting populism with populism, making absurd promises, and then instead of saying what would probably be more rational, or at least more straightforward, but definitely less popular things like, oh, we'll cut military funding, or we'll raise taxes to pay for this, instead of, oh, magic monetary theory will fall from the sky and save us. So what I want to point out is that this is a radically different approach to fight Trumpism. So I don't necessarily think that this is ignoring those other issues. It's saying that if we were to fight those issues, we can't do this. We cannot be successful in these struggles while Trumpism is still around. I want to end with the last paragraph of the flyer that came out of Brendan, the last time Brendan delivered his talk. In addition, the issues that arise in our fight against Trumpism will also be the central political issues in a future destabilized by climate change. So these problems aren't going anywhere, but we have a major obstacle in the way. The fight for the rights of migrants and refugees, the fight against post-truth, resisting the pull towards authoritarianism in times of crisis, etc. So as the crisis gets worse, these problems are going to get worse. So in fact, if we're looking at these crises, I believe, what was it, the Union of Concerned Scientists said that they added another one to their to their pretty stable list. It's always been nuclear proliferation and climate change. Now it's the decline of democracy worldwide. And I don't think that we're capable of tackling those issues if we don't go right for the heart of this and go right for the authoritarian sentiment that's going to get in the way of any future movement that would tackle climate change. And this also requires that we take a radically different approach to these issues than the alternatives out there like the Green New Deal.
I'll pass on this one.
Okay. Well, this is a trick for me to go last. Other people could say, answer all the questions better than me. So I don't think I have too much more to say. I like the way you finished with that paragraph, because I do think that maybe goes to some of the questions about what do you think is important to defeat Trump no matter what. And basically, yes, but I think no matter what doesn't mean that we have no concern for other political issues. I think it's because so many of these other political issues are bound up in the fight against Trumpism that has to become the center, the central concern. I also don't think that that we need to take struggles against authoritarianism, against racism, against climate change, and think that they are limited by Democratic Party political candidates. They can have, those struggles can have their own life and evolution because of the commitment to the people who are in those struggles to those causes and their development as they struggle for those causes. People are intelligent enough not to be limited by the politics of the Democratic Party in 2020. Especially, I think that's the real danger of the environmental movement, is this feeling that the environmental politics need to be sold and turned into this package of positive programs that is going to be like a great selling point to win constituencies and win Trump voters in 2020. I think it really debases the demands and makes sense. We don't have time for that. We need to just fight for a transformation of our infrastructure away from fossil fuels as its own demand, not as a means to, as I said in my talk, not as a means to some New Deal fantasy land. Okay, so let's take some more comments and questions. Yes?
So I kind of want to, several thoughts. One is, of course, when we're talking about defeating Trumpism, we're not just talking about defeating him in 2020. We're talking about something deeper, much more profound, something that in some sense existed before him, and will probably exist after him, even if he is defeated in 2020. So we're really talking about what Marx was talking about, this transformation of this profound thing. So if that happens, now Trumpism is a kind of a toxic poison that feeds that phenomenon.
Yep.
And we have to stanch it. We have to find a way to stop the flow of that poison. And I think if we stop the flow of that poison, it may help a transformation to happen, but I can't. I agree that it's a tough phenomenon, because it's really, it has psychological roots as well as economic. It is a tough nut to change. And I think I would differ a little bit, because it is, if we go against the negative, the negation of the Trump, there does need to be something positive to come, to flow. And Marx did have a vision of socialism or economy. He had a vision of something that could, not just going against. There was a vision of a human society that on some level we have to assume even very sick people may be able to access a longing for. We can only hope. Given that that poison is is no longer available, that avenue is no longer available to them. But if that avenue is just stopped and nothing else is offered in its place, no vision, no hope, then nothing quote unquote positive in some sense, then where will they turn? I don't know what they'll turn to, total violence? I don't know, So that's where I differ a little bit. I think there has to be some, and I think Marx was talking about how the self-activity of the English worker or the white worker would be freed. They would be able to fight for what is really their interests and not some phony bullshit that they were being seduced by the ruling class and led by the strings to buy into something that was crap.
What was it they were being tricked into buying into, though? That's what
A sense of superiority, I'm white, I'm better, I have a place, all this crap that Trump buys them. All the stuff that Trump buys them seduces them with.
Yeah, like this is my country.
I'm Church of England, I'm not Catholic.
All that bullshit.
No, so it's just, it's very similar then.
Hey, I just want to apologize, people who haven't jumped in yet with comments or questions. So are there those people here? Please don't be shy. Please.
I missed so much of what went on, but just my thought when someone said about crushing Trumpism, it just seems like that's like crushing ISIS, ISIS, that it's not, you can't, it's like the endless war, because if the conditions are giving rise to these people, I don't have the answer, but I don't know what it means to say crush them. What does that mean? Kill them with guns? We all get guns and kill them? No, I don't think that's the answer. So what is...
There's no application to guns.
Actually, it's empowering.
I also have a question about the crushing. I also came late, but in prison, impeach. At the moment, I don't see that would work. Impeachment and would actually strengthen Trump. It's my feeling at the present stage. So where are if not that, then the elections. So then we are at the question: is that the only important question? Do we choose the candidate who is most likely? I mean, do we vote in the primary for a candidate who is most likely to defeat Trump? Is that what it's aiming at?
Okay.
What should they say is Biden?
Say the gentleman in the back.
It seems to me it's clear that, with Trump's tax thing for the rich and putting all these people in and taking the environmental stuff that he's doing and all these agencies, it should be obvious that this is not in your interest. Can you explain to me why people still want to support him when everything is against him? They just, they talk about the frog in the water. Mm-hmm. Well, he just slowly takes a little bit more money and a little bit more money, and now your kids have less than you did, and I don't understand. What is it that people see in Trump? You think it's just a racial thing or what? Whoever wants to answer that.
Why don't we jump to the panel, and we can even take the panel out of order. You want to go first, Dan?
Yeah, we've been talking about this for the past 2 sessions, but you weren't all privy to it, so I'm going to try to give an answer, but I hope you'll watch the video of the first panel and this one when they're up on our website. What we've learned is that the Trump supporters are very committed to him, but they're not growing, and they're not, the majority of the people. We're not looking to kill them, but to crush the ideas and have them abandon those ideas. We think that once Trump is thoroughly enough crushed by the majority of the people who are going to vote against him, strip him of all his power and maybe put him in jail, that then his followers will lose their alliance. Now, will they turn into wonderful people? Probably not. They'll probably still be racism and sexism, at least for another generation or two. These things are hard to wipe out, and we know American history and every other country that xenophobia keeps rising up again every so often over the time. So what's it going to take to never have this problem again? Who knows? I would guess it's probably going to have to wait till after we have a socialist revolution and a new socialist society, and no one will have the need to feel superior to other people. But we can't wait for that day. We have to make sure that these ideas are stripped of all their power now, even if 30% of the population still, hates black people and immigrants. They have to understand that they are going to be powerless to impose their horrible views and ideas on the rest of us. And I'm not sure how we'll do it. We'll certainly do it by defeating him roundly in the election. It'll certainly help to put him and his family in jail where they belong. But mostly it's, the other people in the country, the great majority of the country, who are coming forward and saying we won't put up with this. We're going to march in the streets. We're going to do what we have to do to get you out of power, that hopefully will just finally make his ideas, as I say, if not disappear, at least have no more power. So that's what we advocate. Certainly the purpose of the election should be to get Trump out of power. There's no other reason to be interested in a bourgeois election as far as I'm concerned.
Well,
it's not going to bring, well, Congress too, right? We have to, that's the thing, those people
Supreme
who...
Court
Well, Supreme Court's gone, at least until we change the system. Right. So people should be working for Trump's defeat, but also to change the Senate, etc. And there are all kinds of things that could be done to weaken the power of these people with a different government. But it's not going to bring socialism. It's not going to mean there aren't any nasty ideas out there anymore. But certainly it's a necessary but not sufficient step. So I absolutely agree. We have to defeat Trump. Are there other things like regulate the internet so it's not an endless source for children's minds to be poisoned? Maybe we do. I don't know. I wouldn't venture an opinion at this point, but certainly something to explore. All the, not only YouTube and Reddit and those things, but Facebook, we're finding out. Facebook and Instagram and all that, they were all totally prejudiced. They're totally subject to bots and Russian influence and right-wing influence and every other influence. And if that's all that children look at,
there's health care and minimum wage.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things. I think people have to work on their specific issues. Certainly we all have to work on climate change, because we'll all be dead. So we should all be working on that also, but not as the total package of what we have to do, and not without putting aside, I think, the prerequisite before we can win any reforms of getting rid of Trump.
If I can call myself next in the panel's response, the arguments the MHI has been working on about defeating Trumpism, of course, are not aimed at convincing, or not aimed at asking the question of how you convince Trump voters to not be Trump voters, right? The opposite is the argument is the opposite of that is a pointless question. The audience is people on the left who have underestimated the threat of Trumpism, and of just the rising authoritarianism in the world, and maybe also people who aren't necessarily leftists but are involved in the resistance to get to Trump and are looking for philosophical ideas that might help frame their struggles against Trumpism, and maybe also people who are sort of in the political center and don't need to be a little more alarmed about the dangers of Trumpism. I think there was a comment somewhere about it being too late for impeachment or something. I think that's an example of the kind of thinking that we need to really be fighting. I had a fascinating conversation with a friend of mine last week who I consider a sort of a liberal, educated person, but not necessarily a leftist. We went on a long car ride and we got talking about impeachment, and he just rattled off all of the talking points of, you know, oh, the Mueller report didn't really find anything wrong. The only way to defeat Trump is in the election. There's no hope to do anything in the impeachment realm. And I just said, dude, where have you read it? Like, can I buy you a copy of the Mueller report? I mean, I'm almost finished with it. I'll give you my copy. I mean, there are 10 counts of serious obstruction of justice that are, one of which will be grounds for impeachment. And it made me realize that when you hear on the news the polls saying, well, enough of Americans aren't for impeachment, so the Democrats don't want to do it, it made me realize how thick the fog of disinformation and propaganda has become. To see it, I know a friend of mine, who I consider an educated person, to realize how few people are really, the information is not getting through to them, and how adept the propaganda machine has been, from Barr through Trump to Fox News through the general media, in hiding this 10-count indictment in plain sight from the American people. So there's plenty of space for us to defeat Trump before the election if people were fired up enough about it and were demanding impeachment. You know, and this is in my opinion. Any of the panelists want to respond to the things that were said?
I'd really like to say something else that we haven't talked about that's a major issue, which is...
Can I call on you?
Yeah.
Panelists?
Okay.
I would love to call on you.
Okay, first of all, in terms of how do we crush Trumpism, I'm just overjoyed that the perspective of crushing Trumpism has gotten some discussion. This is the first discussion outside of MHI that I've ever heard. Okay? It needs to continue. We don't have the answers yet, but what about if there were left forum plenaries about this? What about if it were talked about in Democracy Now!, you know, in the pages of The Nation, instead of, you know, what kind of program, what kind of talking points, kitchen table issues do we use to pull these voters away and win elections and out-compete this guy? The perspective is entirely different. This doesn't get talked about, first of all. But second of all, this whole idea of going back to the election to defeat Trump in the election, this is not the same country it used to be. Right. How many people here think that Trump will voluntarily leave office if he loses the election?
Right.
Okay. How many people think that on some pretext he will appeal to the Supreme Court? Right. How many people think that he will win the election 5-4 in the Supreme Court if he takes it there? Correct. That was done in the year 2000. Okay. What about Russian interference that Adam Plante was talking about? Correct. This whole idea that you're going to play it safe and get Trump out by mobilizing people in an electoral fashion, and that's the first step, and we don't have to take more, you know, extreme steps. Take it step by step. That belongs to the past. Okay? We are on the damn knife edge in this country. There are no sure victories, but getting him out of office by means of you know, pulling lever for Democrats or whatever, that is really risky, you know, in this day and age.
You mean relying on that?
Relying on that. That's strategy of we're going to make this country better. You know, are you going to win the election? You know, and then what, you're going to complain that the Russians interfered? We know they're going to interfere. You know, every dirty trick of the book. He's not going to go voluntarily. I'm not the only one saying this. I mean, mainstream writers, like I think Amanda Marcotte, all kinds of people.
Nancy Pelosi's saying it.
Yeah, okay, all kinds of people.
Overwhelmingly, he's going to...
Right, okay. Yeah, we have, right, Nancy Pelosi said we have to win by a landslide because if it's close, then he's going to contest the damn thing. Okay, people realize, but people are afraid to say we have to mobilize not only on electoral grounds, but on non-electoral grounds as well. Yeah. Okay. What if there's like, it doesn't have to be violent. What about if there are 40 million people who march to the White House and say, get the hell out of here, you're gone, dude? What about if there's a general strike? Not a one-day general strike. I mean, a real general strike that cripples every major city in this country. Okay? Could this change the face of this country in a moment? Yeah. With regard to Charlie, you know, I'm all for talking about a new human society, but if it's left abstract and it just sounds impotent, okay? It's got to be tied to a vision of defeating this white nationalism and you know, then moving forward once we defeat it. Okay, so it will, you can't, people who are getting their bennies from it are going to want it until it's crushed. So.
I just want to point out that this is really different from any of the alternatives I've seen so far.
I think there's a real issue with China, okay? So, the Museum of Modern Art, before they closed to do their major renovation, showed a whole lot of films from all over the place, including working in factories in the Midwest, cars and so on, and being bought out by the Chinese. And then the Chinese lowering, from the start, unionized, lowering the wages like 2/3. And these people had no choice, but they were doing the same work in the same plant, but for like much less money as the American citizens. And we need to acknowledge that we're at a turning point in the world where we're not the boss anymore. Or we may not, we think we are, but I don't think that Trump, I don't think he's thinking this way, or I don't think he understands, I don't think he's smart enough to understand it, to tell you the truth. But the world is changing, and our place in the world is changing.
The gentleman, sorry, I didn't hear from you already. I'll get back to you. Mike, I didn't hear from you yet.
Yeah, there was also a film festival, a little bit smaller scale than MoMA, but someplace in Brooklyn, about 89 in China, Tiananmen Square. It's not just about sort of social democratic nationalism, because I think that hastens fascism just as quickly as people say neoliberalism does. I appreciated the panel making it clear that it's about it's about crushing Trumpism. And yeah, I guess I want to know how people who, I mean, is there any relation not to the candidates themselves? What's the relation to the rest of the left that sees in a sort of picture thinking, right? That, well, we look at capitalism on this side, communism on this side, and the gains of economic left populism is somewhere in the middle, and if we can get only closer to that, you know, it seems to me a very simplistic, linear kind of thing. How do you defeat that kind of idea, right? And there's a tension there too, of course, because people are fighting for whatever gains they can get under the system. But that as a program, that's not a way to an emancipatory future that I can see. It just, as Andrew has written about, it also snaps back because the system is driven on profit. If you do things to take away profit, you have to prepare people, right? People have to, you know, it's a permanent movement toward. And I think, do you guys think that's a dead end, or it can be a movement toward, I guess is a simplistic way of putting it.
If there's anyone who hasn't spoken yet, I don't want to.
Yeah,
Yes, please, right there.
You know, the idea of a general strike, I think, is a way you can actually get things done. But I also think, how would you make that happen? You can't. Only the workers can make it happen.
You don't make it happen.
Congress subdivides it.
How?
Pissed off people.
Yeah.
And right here.
Yes, I understand the importance of dumping Trump.
but I don't think there's been enough discussion here of how you're linking workers' activity and the emancipatory potential of the working class with achieving that objective. You just can't detach the two. It's fine to talk about how you can have massive general strike if Trump decides to become a self-appointed dictator and so forth. But who's going to show up for that? How are they going to go there? What's the program that they get mobilized for? I mean, you're knocking on the Green New Deal. I accept that because the Green New Deal is done within the parameters of capitalism. What's the alternative program? How are people going to be more motivated and activated? Another thing about Andrew's analysis that I was wondering about. Marx was talking about how the emancipatory potential of the English and American working classes would be elevated by getting rid of slavery on one hand and getting rid of the neo-colonial oppression environment on the other hand. But you were making as an analogy there, well, we have to get rid of Trump. But Trumpism is not equivalent to like a slave mode of production or a neo-colonial relationship between an imperial power like England and a subordinated power like Ireland. It's not the same thing. I mean, just what is Trumpism? It has to be more rigorously defined. It's not a mode of production. I mean, Trumpism, it's been around for a long time. I read a piece by Frank Rich in his blog where he was describing just how close Wallace came to being nominated by the Democratic Party in 1968, and I think the main reason that didn't happen was that he was shot and turned into a paraplegic. He turned out to be almost as strong as Trump in all the battleground states that Trump won. Okay, and Trump probably won those states because of disenfranchisement of the voters there, which was probably done by local Republican operatives. So the thing is, even if you get Trump knocked out of power, you have a whole apparatus that is moving sharply towards authoritarianism that would persist even if he wasn't elected. I mean, it's kind of like a tactical objective to displace him out of power, but there has to be a strategic objective that's more, better thought out than I think that is being presented here. I mean, what you're doing is extracting out one focal objective, which is getting rid of Trump, but it's not linked with all the political currents that are churning through, our country, and linking them together in a cohesive analysis. It seems a little flimsy. And I'm not in any way denigrating the importance of this authoritarian thrust. But there's two elements of it. One is the element of the state, which has been increasingly authoritarian with each administration, Democratic or Republican. And the other is sort of the cultural transformation of a sector of the population that's getting swept away with white nationalism and all kinds of, I guess, heady projections of power if they have an authoritarian executive in place.
Let's take some responses from the panel, and I hope that we have even time for another round of questions briefly.
Or extend. I mean, it's only a 2-hour panel. They could get to everything you mentioned if we can program a whole conference on all of it.
But we have like 3 or 4 people, so let's just jump. We don't have to be in order. So, Dan, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Mike was sort of hinting at. The answer is you all have to get involved in this project. Don't expect MHI or a small group, to figure it all out and come up with a program, because it's going to take many, many people. And why I've been talking so much about how bad the left is, because I'm trying to turn that around. I'm trying to get more people interested in saying, no, we've been, barking up the wrong tree. We've just been talking about elections or single issues or neoliberalism is even worse, whatever. They haven't taken on the project of getting rid of Trump and starting something new. And put on a conference that talks about that, or insist that the left forum talk about that instead of just It's always, you know, oh, how can the left all get together so we have more power? And it's ridiculous because we don't agree with the, I mean, we don't even call ourselves leftists anymore because most of the left is so rotten. So, yeah, what are you going to do?
I call myself a leftist, and I say the other people are faux leftists, fake left, I'm right. But look, nobody can give anybody a guarantee here. Give anybody a guarantee here, okay? There is absolutely no basis for, you know, just confidence that we'll pull out of this crisis, that the world won't descend into a new dark ages that lasts only 10 years because the environment is completely obliterated, you know? So if you're looking for some assurance that what we're saying is going to be the road, you know, no, because it's not easy, okay? What we can say is that a general strike, you know, 40 million people marching in the White House, these could turn things around. Can we make that happen in an instant? No. Now, with regard to this issue of, first of all, we didn't say that getting rid of Trump will do wonders. None of us said that, okay? Mike picked up on that. We've made a distinction between Trump and Trumpism. It's been stated repeatedly here. People are nodding their heads, okay? Okay? Trumpism, and I said it in my talk, is a pre-existing condition. Wallaceism is Trumpism. Trumpism is Wallaceism redux. That's in our pamphlet, okay? So this is what we're talking about. Okay. And the fact that it's not a mode of production is neither here nor there. I completely reject that because the analogy is based on what Marx was talking about, was overcoming the white nationalism, the identification with the ruling class among sections of the working class was identifying with people, you know, the ruling classes of their nation. Okay? And that's what's happening among white Trumpites in this country. Okay? That's what has to be overcome, and it's not going to be overcome, you know, by defeating Trump in the election. That's not going to do it. That's not enough. And it's not going to be overcome, you know, by seducing them with social democratic programs. Okay? They are getting certain benefits, psychological wages as white people. Okay? That has to be overcome. And that's what Marx was getting at with the defeat of England in its attempt to hold over Ireland, which is also not a matter of mode of production. They also had a capitalist mode of production in Ireland, you know.
Yeah, because of structural relationships, whereas what some voters may have in their head is not a structural relationship.
It doesn't matter. That's what he was focused on, was what people have in their heads.
Since we said 10 minutes, I know some people have been wanting to say things. Let me just call on Chip. Do you want to?
Real fast, people should look at the website, The Fragility of Democracy by one of the world's leading experts of when Weimar collapsed into fascism. Because according to his analysis, and I've spoken with him, we're in that moment now. And the chance of, if Trump loses the next election, we're coming out of it with a democracy are slim. Not impossible, but slim. And I can tell you that there's an international network of scholars looking at how right-wing populism turns into fascism because, according to Professor Roger Griffin, fascism is the most militarized form of right-wing populism. We see right-wing populist governments around the world turn into fascist governments. You gotta wake up. Time is running out. We are at an interregnum point, which is why he's so worried, and about 300 scholars are saying, watch out, this could happen all over Europe and the United States. So pay attention.
Fragility of democracy?
Yes.
Okay, what if we see more, is there anything more to help identify that?
Well, just the phrase, the fragility of democracy, calls up the Facing History in Ourselves website where this professor has posted a whole educational...
Robert Griffin?
No, I'm in touch with Roger Griffin. We're all in big trouble. Yeah. I mean, most of the people who study this stuff said this is like a bad time.
Yeah.
No, it's an obscure professor at UMass Boston who wrote a whole wonderful book on how democracy collapses step by step. We're already way down the line.
Well, yeah.
So
I would like to respond to that.
can I take maybe one more question? If there are, the gentleman in the sunglasses.
Yeah, I wanted to react to the remark that that China and whatnot becoming strong and the country, the US, not so strong. I don't think that's true. The US is still very strong. I mean, the only country that has the, I don't know how many hundred military bases everywhere. Well, on the world scene, it's one victory after the other, Egypt, Argentina, Brazil, whatever, India. So I wouldn't trust too much this sort of decline. And to the other, let me make a remark about the other thing also. Perhaps but what we need most against Trumpism is after all the eco-socialist idea or whatever. I mean, it seems to be sort of clear that kind of the ultimate argument for Marxism is that the old system is destroying the world. And
which system?
The old system, the capitalist system, is destroying the world. And well, I mean, the best one can cope for as the plans are, plans seem to be, is that a small section of mankind will survive and will have an extremely unequal society. I mean, that perspective seems to be quite clear to me, besides the fact that the extermination of mankind is also a possibility. So this is what one has to explain to people. I think we need arguments first of all.
Yeah, climate and resource allocations can alter the population balance around it. Some will.
Do people on the panel want to weigh in finally on if there's some other past things or make final comments?
Well, we do final
comments. That's fine with me. I can do either one. You want to make a final comment, or you can speak about something someone has said. Why don't we go down the line?
Okay. So just to respond to Chip's point real quick. About the fragility of democracy and how people need to wake up. I stumbled across a CNN opinion piece from a year or two ago when that book, How Democracies Die, came out. That was the book you're referring to?
That's a great one.
And in this opinion piece, which I think was a review of the book, the author of the opinion piece quoted this section where the authors of this book, How Democracies Die, came up with basically a checklist of is Trump an authoritarian? Checked all the boxes. But then the section that they quoted said, but in 2017 there wasn't a significant slide back, the institutions held up. But then they stopped the quote there. If you look, I remember this passage, if you look immediately afterwards, it says, but if we look at other countries like South America, it usually takes a couple of years and then there's a significant decline back. So what I want to point out is I think people understand that politics in this country is shallow. Congress has a god-awful approval rating. You could voter turnout is terrible. You could pick anybody off the street and they would tell you that, at best you get to elect one of the lesser of two evils if they're running for president. But I think in the fight for the preservation of even that limited democracy, people get a taste of freedom and they seek to move beyond these limits. And so the resistance, we have a pamphlet about this from last April, April of 2018 actually, is 30 million strong as of that date, with an additional 73 to 99 million people. That's a lot who strongly disapprove of Trump in America. That's a huge number of people. These people feel physically that they are under attack. And so the resistance to Trump is the most significant mass movement, certainly in my lifetime, but easily since Vietnam. And it's a coalition of so many different issues. You go to these marches, at least the extremely large ones, there are so many issues there that people are concerned with at this panel. But if you go to these marches, at least the anti-Trump marches that are large, they will all be pinpointed at what the heart of the biggest obstacle in the way of this is. This authoritarian, reactionary sentiment that is taking over the world again and is just completely rolling back with little protections against these issues that were already inadequate. So, yeah, I guess don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and people really need to start taking this seriously because it's already happening, and just because our institutions have held up for so long doesn't mean that they will forever.
Rosa Luxemburg was pretty good on that.
We go to my final comments, and we'll try to make them too long, just a few minutes.
Yeah, so she was.
And do you want to say anything?
No, I'll pass.
Okay. Andrew?
So people haven't given up, but the Democratic Party is doing everything it can to demoralize the resistance, by Nancy Pelosi's electoral politics of, like, I don't know what the hell she thinks she's doing. That's really an attempt to say, yeah, okay, Nancy, I'd like to see him in prison too, but we've got to impeach the motherfucker. And then the bread and circus's attention be given to this election where, God damn, we might not reach this next election. Okay, so, the resistance is powerful, but we've got to keep people from being demoralized and demobilized by the Democrats. But look, we might not be able to do this on our own in this country. Hitler took over Germany, and Franco took over Spain, and Mussolini, Italy, and there was really nothing that the people in those countries could do, except be liberated from the outside. But what the left did in Spain was send international brigades to try to keep the country democratic. And some of us here, are trying to work with people outside the United States to extend solidarity to the people of the United States against Trumpism, and they're not establishing international brigades at this point, but, the initial act of solidarity can lead to places. So we can appeal to help from abroad if our own resources are too meager to overthrow the conditions that we face, which they could well be. Mm-hmm. Everybody here could be in prison in the not too distant future.
In my talk, that was this talk. Anyway, I'm all for eco-socialism if it means an actual break with capitalism and a more ecological society. I'm not for eco-socialism if it means the New Deal with bent on green infrastructure and solar panels. But I've already talked about my disagreements with that, at least to some extent, so I don't have time to develop those more. But I do think that doesn't mean that we don't have time for a politics that says we have to wait till we transcend capitalism to deal with the ecological crisis. I mean, just practically speaking, there's enough time to do it, right? So dealing with the ecological crisis needs to be dealt with on its own terms. That's why I'm making the argument. If it was 100 years off, I could say, okay, let's work on transcending capitalism, and then we'll rebuild the infrastructure. There's no time for that. So it needs to be dealt with on its own terms, not the terms of social democrats who wanted it to be their way to get into power so they can launch their reboot of the New Deal. It needs to be dealt with, this is what we have to do to transform society, let's do it with whatever means we can. Maybe it means raising taxes, which the Green New Deal people don't want to talk about. Maybe it means taking money from other things like the military. I don't know, I'm not a policy person, I can't make those calculations. But I think we need to be realists. I mean, we don't have time to screw around with BS. And I'll close by saying that the reason in my paper I went to the trouble of framing it in terms of unchallenged assumptions behind, I think, some of the Green New Deal thinking is that I think a lot of that uncritical thinking lies behind left thought. And on the left, we like to think of ourselves as being more educated than the right. and being smarter and not being fooled by propaganda. But underneath a lot of populism lies just as much groupthink, hysterical thinking, appeals to unreason and to mythology. These sort of mythologies of the left that have lived on for generations that need just as much challenging as right-wing assumptions and mythologies. And we don't have time to just ignore them and hope that there'll be enough people on the vote to keep it going. We have to stop and deal with these things now. So, thank you for your time. Please check out Marxist-Humanist and sign up on the mailing list.
You can buy our books and pamphlets here or down at our table for about an hour.
We have a lot more books at the table.